ways in which they are advancing equity in the district. As a reminder, please know that this session is being recorded. If you wish not to be recorded visibly on here, you can definitely mute your video. And as always, throughout the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. I will be dropping shortly a link to a Padlet in the chat where you can capture your reflections and your thoughts and questions. I know some people may still choose to use the chat, but we want to make sure that any questions you actually want the panel to respond to, you capture those in the Padlet. So for today's session, we have 3 phenomenal panelists with us today: Dr. Kamika Royal, Ishmael Jimenez, and Debbie Way. Dr. Kamika Royal will be presenting with us today on Not Paid for Us, Black Educators in Public School Reform in Philadelphia. Dr. Royal is a native Philadelphian and an urban education expert whose work focuses on the intersections of racism, politics, history, and urban school reform. Her debut book, Not Paid for Us, Black Educators in Public School Reform in Philadelphia, is available for pre-order now. You can get it right now, and it will be released in May from the Harvard Education Press. So thank you again, Dr. Royal, for being with us. Next, we have Ishmael Jimenez, who will be presenting Breathing Life into a Dying Art. Ishmael Jimenez is a social studies curriculum specialist for the School District of Philadelphia, which serves a district-wide population of over 130,000 students. The philosophical orientation that guides Ishmael's teaching and activism is rooted in a theoretical educational framework developed by Paulo Freire, which emphasizes the interconnected nature of education with participating in the transformation of the world. So thank you again, Ishmael, for joining us. And last but certainly not least, we have Debbie Way, who will be presenting So Much Reform, So Little Change. Debbie is currently a curriculum specialist for social studies in the School District of Philadelphia and a formal national organizer with the Zen Education Project. She is also a founder of the Folk Arts Cultural Treasures Charter School, FACTS, and served as the first principal and executive director. So thank you again, Debbie, for joining us. Again, before I turn it over to our panelists, if you have any questions, please drop those in the Padlet that I will put into the chat for you, and we will go from there. Our panelists will have about 10 minutes to do their presentation, so they will come in their own way. I'm churchy, so this is what we say. You'll come in your own way, and then we will reserve questions for the end of the session. So we'll allow each panelist to have their full time. So without further ado, Dr. Royal, it's all on you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I am so excited to be here with you. I had to start my timer, make sure I don't go over my 10 minutes. This is officially my first time talking publicly about the book as it is now in production, and I'm so excited that I get to do it with my Philly folks. So I think you can see the screen of the book right now. Yes, okay. So this is the cover of the book that I started as a doctoral student at Temple when taking Origins of Urban Education with Dr. Bill Cutler 14 years ago. I didn't know this project would become a book, but we were simply challenged to do an original research project around some element of Philadelphia school history. And as a native Philadelphian who was raised in Penrose, but very much loved on by the elders at Enon Tabernacle Baptist Church on Coulter Street, I knew that I knew far too many people who had experienced these changes in the district to not tap into them. And I'm so glad I got to sit with my elders and just start listening to their stories, because it sent me on so many different directions. And some of those folks who shared their stories have now transitioned out of this life. And so I'm glad that I got an opportunity to sit and to listen and to learn from them. My Philadelphia history and my Philadelphia story that brought me to this book, I think it's fascinating, at least to me. So my mother is a 1965 graduate of Germantown High School. And I would listen, she also went to Leeds Junior High School. And I listened to stories about my mother's experiences in these schools as a student who was pushed to the commercial track and told she wasn't college material. And then when my sister was a student at Penrose Elementary School, her being sort of, when she was asking about why my sister's reading wasn't progressing in the ways she expected them to, she was sort of rebuffed by a principal who told her, you know, you don't have the qualifications to question us on how the learning isn't happening. And so at that point, my mother pulled my sister out of Philly's public schools and sent both of us to private school, where we returned to the district for both of us to go to school at Pepper Middle School. Pepper, which we know closed, Pepper and Germantown, in 2013. So that is how I enter this work, not just as someone who sat with my elders, but also someone whose family experienced different changes in the district, who personally experienced certain changes in the district. Over the course of 13 years, from 2008 to, I guess, 10 years, 2018 is when I did my last interview. I interviewed 28 different educators for about 100 hours around their experiences in the district. Each person I interviewed worked through at least 2 superintendents or chief executive officers for the school district of Philadelphia. And they had some stories to tell. I also got to interview Dr. Constance Clayton, which was a beautiful experience for me, especially because I was a student. I was in middle school and high school when she was superintendent. And you all, I mean, if you're from Philly, then you know about when we would have inclement weather and we'd be like, y'all think we're gonna have to go to school tomorrow? You know, Constance Clayton is gonna make us go to school tomorrow. So when I got to sit down and talk to her, it was really exciting and just really informed some really important ideas in my work. I will say this book, Gloria Ladson Billings wrote the foreword to the book. She is also a graduate of the School District of Philadelphia. She graduated from Overbrook High School in January of 1965. And she taught in Philadelphia for 10 years prior to becoming this internationally renowned education superstar and pedagogical theorist. When I heard Ishmael described as a social studies coach, is it? She was actually a social studies, what they call collaborator in the 1970s, working on curriculum for the School District of Philadelphia. So it feels like a major feat to not just have this world-renowned scholar, but also somebody who, I call her my favorite scholar out of West Philly. Because if you talk to her long enough, you will definitely hear, you don't have to talk to her that long to hear West Philly all up and through who she is. The book is a critical book, though. So I want to be very clear about that. I say in the introduction that my book takes a left of Democratic Party stance. So I just, kind of want it to be known that when you look at the book, some of it may be hard to digest. Some of it may challenge some of the things we thought we knew about what was happening in the district. In some ways, it may challenge the idea of who's an ally, what that looks like, what that sounds like, what people are willing to do and willing to give up in order to advance someone else. So the book is organized by superintendent loosely, except for the second chapter, which is organized by mayor. So the book goes from 1967 to 2017. Each chapter is named after an iconic hip hop album from my youth. So the first chapter is Fear of a Black Planet, which looks at Mark Shedd's era. The next one is called Thug Life, Frank Rizzo's Law and Disorder. The Constance Clayton chapter is known as Black Rain. Then it's Ready to Die, which is the David Hornbeck chapter. Things Fall Apart is the Paul Vallis chapter. And Black on Both Sides examines the Ackerman and Haidt eras. So I am just excited that it's finally coming into the world. Hopefully it will not only inform, but also critique and challenge. Hopefully it pushes educators forth. Hopefully it gives space and not amplifies the voices of the educators who have done their best to persist for our children in spite of ridiculous conditions. Hopefully it honors my own teachers the people who I encountered at Pepper Middle School and at Central High School, who invested their time and their energy and their investment in me. Hopefully you see yourselves represented in some compelling ways in this book. Hopefully it pushes forward conversations about what reform should look like, what it should be like, how we need to be a bit more honest about politics. And when people say things like get politics out of schools, there are no schools without politics. All of it's politics. And the people who are telling you that they stand on neutrality is a political position. There are no schools without politics. And when they tell you that, they are trying to sell you something, right? And so I hope that this book gives a voice to that as well. I'm gonna stop there. And I believe that was 8 minutes. So I'm very proud of myself for coming under the time.
You definitely did. So shout out to you for that. Thank you so much, Dr.
Oh,
Royal.
one more thing. The book can be pre-ordered directly from Harvard Education Press, which I think you can see on the screen now. If you want to support a Philly bookstore, the book is available for pre-order from Uncle Bobby's. If you need to shop at Amazon, the book is also available on Amazon. So you have options.
I think Ishmael dropped the link in the chat for us, so we will recirculate that again. So thank you so much, Dr. Royal. Again, for folks, if you have questions that you want Dr. Royal to address or thoughts, please make sure that you are uploading those in the Padlet, and we will address them at the end of the session. So next we will have Ishmael Jimenez, who will come in his own fashion. Ishmael, it's on you.
Yes. Well, hello, everybody. I am super intimidated to go after Dr. Royal. I've been a super fan since we first met. And what was that, like five years ago? And just the truth was just coming out of your pores. And I was like, I need to get around that person. And the first words of wisdom, before I start, I just want to drop that she told us as educators was to find our squad, to find the folks that we're going to build around with that will lead towards, not only the education piece, but the activism piece. And I love how that's conflated, right? That we recognize that what we're doing is activism and at the same time education. And those two aren't separable. So I just want to preface my talk by saying I'm truly humbled to go after you, Dr. Royal, always, and I can't wait to read that book. So with all that being said, my talk is about breathing life into this dying art. And when I say breathing life into this dying art, I'm speaking about the art of teaching. The ability and approach that we have when we talk about pedagogy, when we talk about what we should focus on, what we value, right? When our students are in our classrooms. And as an educator for the past 12 years, before I took the social studies curriculum specialist position, I was first at Germantown High School until the Great Purge in 2013, when I was then subsequently laid off and then called back the following October and ended up at Kensington Kappa. And that's where I was my 8 years remaining in teaching. And through that process, of course, I learned to navigate such treacherous waters and uncertainty, but at the same time, recognize the beauty of the classroom and what our students, the natural genius that our students bring to us, and that unfortunately sometimes is shut out. So through this process, I always emphasize, like, a teacher doesn't learn. I mean, if a teacher doesn't learn from their students, that means the students don't learn from them. And the lessons that I learned from my students that went through this process is that all our students come with dreams. Like, their parents send their best to us every single day. And we have not only a responsibility, but a duty not to treat this as a job. Unfortunately, since 2001, with No Child Left Behind, and then, Race to the Top under the Obama administration, and Every Student Succeed Act now, or whatever Orwellian phrase they want to apply to the future of our children, I've realized that this system overall is not conducive for our children's learning. And in actuality is meant to just reinforce structures and socialize them into where they need to be within the structure of our society. And with that knowledge, I think that one thing I realized that we have to speak honestly to our children about that reality. And that reality is meant to really just, here, let's take out this child, and be like, look, those children do it, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? You're a failure. And our society emphasizes that. And not only is the child getting that message in the school building, but they're also getting it from their favorite rapper. They're also getting it from their TV shows. They're also getting it from their parents. And our society goes into cyclical process where we're measuring the value of our students by definitions developed from folks that look at our students as unnecessary and disposable. And we have to be honest about that. No longer can we walk around and be like, well, we need to bring up this and bring up that, and we need to focus on this. When in reality, if we look at all the statistics over the last 20 years, 21 years since No Child Left Behind, our students are faring worse. Their reading levels and their math abilities have been reduced, not increased, with the increase of tests. And that's the reality, you know, and I work for the school district, so I don't want to bash tests too hard, but we have to be honest of its eugenics base, right? Tests were meant to weed out who's good and who's not, who's acceptable, what we want to see and who we don't want to see, what type of jobs, right? And that was the original purpose of tests. And of course, that went around racial lines. But if you look at all the research, students perform as well on the test, not if they have two parents, not what race they are, but their socioeconomic status. And instead of embracing that and moving towards a situation where we have integration around socioeconomic status, we move towards a situation where we consolidate poverty in schools while at the same time uplifting the ones that are, the rhetoric, that are responsible, who accept the responsibility, all that nonsense. And we cookie cut that and place them in positions where they are able to succeed and interact with folks of different socioeconomic backgrounds. Now, with all that being said, when I say breathing life into this dying art, it's dying. If anything, I don't want to sound like Nas and say hip hop is dead, or we're going with the hip hop references, right? But education is dead. When we talk about education, you know, I don't want to send my son to school where they spent most of the day test prepping for a test for a fact I know that does not measure their academic ability, and they internalize that they're failures if they don't do that well. And that's real. And that feels something much more deeper than one. So they wonder why students, like, I don't read, I don't do that. Well, because they associate education with school. Think about that. They associate education with school. So much so that it shuts down the idea of what education is, the beauty of it, of the ability to dialogue with diverse perspectives and approach a subject with a mind open, with an inquiry. And don't get it twisted. The students do that every single day. That's why I always point it out to them. You in the lunchroom for a half an hour, you ever notice lunch goes like this? Because you're engaged in what is called intersubjectivity. You're engaging in dialogue where not only are you sharing your ideas, but you're listening to other people's ideas, and you're drawing conclusions based off of what you think is reality and what they think is reality. And your shift might happen if you might hear something that challenges your reality. But when you engage in intersubjectivity, that happens. And see, this is the level that we need to bring our students in. No longer can we pigeonhole and be like, I am the purveyor of all knowledge. I know what you need to know in order to do what you need to do. We have to listen. And not only listen, but also reconcile the fact that our children are not doing well. You know, when we talk about the increase of violence in the city of Philadelphia, when we talk about the increase of carjackings and everything that's in the media that's flooding us right now, that's not our children. That's a reflection of us. We're not talking anymore. We're not talking honestly anymore. And we wonder why we're in the path that we find ourselves in. So breathing life in this dying art is shifting from a Eurocentric mind state of competition, individualism. Oh, don't worry about those other students, just worry about yourself. You know how many kids hear that every single day? And they have to reconcile with the fact when they were in kindergarten and first grade, they're like, oh, you got to share. You got to share. And as they get older, it's like, no, those kids are going to fail. Just worry about yourself. And then we wonder why we're in the situation that we find ourselves in. And when we breathe life into this dying art, it's shifting from that mindset into that, from that worldview into a worldview that values humanity over material accumulation. The goal of education should not be based on how much money you might make or what type of job you might have. The goal of education is to become a better human being. And somewhere along the way, that got lost in translation. And we have turned into a situation where students like, well, I can go outside, hustle, and make as much money. Why do I have to even sit in here and waste my time listening to this Eurocentric nonsense? And of course, the words aren't there. The ideas aren't fully articulated, but they feel it. We feel it. And we have to approach it in a way where we're like, yo, it isn't about that, man. It's about what you gain, what you grow, what you share, who you become. And I know for a fact that all the years that I have taught, students still reach out to me and have expressed that, have expressed how they were listening, but they weren't there. And that they're there now and they're trying to figure out which way to go. And I can't emphasize how hard it is to see a student that you try to reach in class and you see them outside a fresh grocer and then you see all the years of oppression in their eyes. And the first thing they say, hey, Mr. Jimenez, you got $1? That's a reality. And it isn't about saving anybody. It's about breathing life into this dying art where that child felt supported, not just in my class, but in all the classes that they attend. The classes that gave them substance. There is no reason when I ask everybody, even adults, how many of y'all went through a whole year sitting in a class and didn't learn anything and walked away with an A? Think about that. That means we're giving folks a false sense of who they are. And then the world smacks them in the face. Yeah. So when we go into this process, when we think about what we're doing, we have to stop just going along to get along. We need to stop allowing folks who don't know our children, who actually look at our children as nothing, to dictate what our children are learning in our schools. We need to talk to our children in a way that prioritizes their understanding in the world and start the process of deconstructing that. There's no reason, and I know, hopefully I won't get in trouble for saying this, there is no reason why students are going to be walking into school in the next couple of weeks and taking the Keystone exams or the PSSAs right now in this environment. And I know that there's things outside of our control, but until folks start aggressively pushing back for the benefit of our children, this is going to continue to happen. And we've been warned from great educators, from Dr. Royal, right, to Dr. John Hendrick Clark, to Ella Baker even, about the importance of centering our students and centering their experiences when we talk about what needs to be done. And we're not doing that right now. We're centering our jobs. And that's a challenge I want to put out to everybody. And I wasn't keeping time, so hopefully I didn't go over. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ish. I gave you a few extra minutes, but thank you for sharing such powerful words and sharing your heart and where you are in that and being vulnerable in this space. Definitely appreciate your bravery in that way. So we have one more panelist, Debbie, if you would come in and share in your own way. And I know we have some trouble with the Padlet, so we're working on that right now to get it going, and then you'll be able to capture your thoughts there. But you can also drop them in the chat and I will make sure I keep track of them. Thank you. Debbie?
Wow. Following these two speakers is Ish, you left me a little speechless. Ishmael and I actually are 2 cubicles apart, down there in 440, and spent a lot of time talking. And his heart is, yeah, I can't say enough. Before I start, I do want to acknowledge that the title that I gave my talk, so much reform, so little change, actually came from a paper that Charles Payne wrote some time ago. And I also want to acknowledge that a lot of my thinking around education and school reform is shaped by Jimmy and Grace Lee Boggs. So I have to shout out my elders before I start. And also, like I was told, this is about history. So I'm kind of diving into the history of public education a little bit. So Isabel Wilkerson, her book Caste, she tells a story about how we deal with racism in the US. And she talks about a house that has structural problems. The foundation is bad, but we built on it. And the flaws keep showing up and we keep covering it. We wallpaper it, we paint it, but the foundation is rotten. And so the wallpaper doesn't fix the house because we never address the structure. And these days I use that analogy a lot when I talk about education reform. So think about this, like for almost a century, every kid in the US has been required by federal law to attend school until the age of 16. And we here in 2022 are still trying to figure out school reform. And we're still trying to figure out how to make education work for our communities. After 100 years, really? So in my mind, there are only two explanations for this failure. We're either building on a faulty foundation or it's failure by design. So either way, I wanted to reflect on a fundamental question we need, I think, to think about before we begin any project in school reform. And that is, what is the purpose of education? What does it mean to be educated? And if you ask most Americans what the purpose of education is, it's to get a good job. And we tend to think it's always been this way. But actually, it's only been about 3 generations that school has been what we see now. Historically, let's say in ancient civilizations, China or Rome, they used education to prepare a very small group of elite to govern over everyone else. And during the Middle Ages in Europe, education was about learning Latin so you could read the Bible. In America, schools were originally created for the rich and the elite. They prepared the children of the rich, just like the Romans did, to govern over the poorer segments of society. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, only 6% of US youth graduated from high school. So education and schooling said the same thing. They're two different things. And it's not that education wasn't happening, it was happening, but education was viewed as not only the purview of the institution of schools. Education meant learning trades, it meant learning arts, supporting the needs of your family and your community, learning from elders and artisans. Public schooling began early in the 20th century. This is when schooling started to get required in the elementary grades. There was a need for workers who had basic English and literacy skills now that factories were opening up. At the same time, all these immigrants were pouring in to fill those factory jobs. So mass public education evolved to provide very basic literacy and to assimilate immigrants into the American way. Massachusetts was a site of massive factories and large numbers of immigrant workers. And they passed the first compulsory school laws in the US in 1852. The law required elementary school level education, but very minimal. So by 1911, only 11% of the high school age population was in school. In 1920, only 20%. Initially, especially high schools in the US, they were very elite spaces reserved for privileged few as preparation for university. Over time, as more high school age youth entered the school system, schools became sorting machines. They had academic tracks, and the tracks separated the winners from the losers. Some people got to finish high school and go on to college. A great majority went into the labor market after a few years of elementary school, or at most, maybe a year or so of high school. By 1940, 73% of high school age youth were attending school, but not necessarily completing high school. After the Second World War, a new purpose for mass education evolved. So agriculture in the South became mechanized. Agricultural work began disappearing. Wartime economies brought millions of families migrating to cities in the North and created wartime jobs. But after the war, those jobs went away. Competition for jobs increased. There was a lot of unemployment. And with the loss of jobs, something needed to be done because the losers in the sorting machine were out there, and they were referred to as juvenile delinquents. And people of a certain age, my age, will remember this term, juvenile delinquency. It was a crisis in the United States. And the solution was compulsory education through the age of 16. So school was designed from its foundation to become detention and holding places for the losers. High school wasn't considered an elite pathway for a few anymore, but it did turn into custodial institutions to keep everyone in a classroom and off the streets. And since it became compulsory, the sorting machine then became geographical and class-based, and still ensuring that the elite classes stayed on top. By 1960, 90% of high school age youth were attending school. Within 40 years, the high school transformed into college prep for the few and mass detention for the many. In low-income areas, high school diplomas, they were pretty much just evidence that you were following compulsory school law. Success in public school systems was measured in, some of you will remember this term, lowering the dropout rate, not actually meeting any educational goals per se. So in the 60s, we started to see a rise in student and community resistance to detention center models. That was the beginning of the real mass cry for ethnic studies in education. Why ethnic studies? Because they wanted education. People wanted an education that reflected the community and was for the benefit of the community. And few remember that student demands in San Francisco State strike were that professors didn't get tenure from publishing papers, but from what they contributed to the communities. I know I'm gonna try to speed up. We're living in a pandemic. Despite of our best efforts, it's widened the educational gap, fractured what community did exist in school, tested the resilience of students, parents, and teachers, but it also created an opportunity. What can education look like at the back end of this pandemic? What is the purpose of education? So in the 1990s, I just want to throw these out for reflection. Indigenous educators in Alaska attempted to outline their own standards for the purposes of education. And they came up with a list of standards. And I want you to think about just two of them that I pulled out. One, assume responsibility. Students will assume responsibility for their role in relation to the well-being of the cultural community and their lifelong obligations as a community member. And the second one, interact with elders in a loving and respectful way that demonstrates an appreciation of their role as culture bearers and educators in the community. So my question is, are these things that we want youth to learn? And are they things that they can learn in our current educational system? In a system that's not responsive to communities, and where if you make it in schooling, the goal is for you to leave your community. I don't believe that schooling's main purpose is to prepare people for a job. I think unemployment in the US is not due to lack of schooling. It's due to an economy that prioritizes economic development over human development. And how we take this moment in time, this opportunity to really articulate the purpose of education so young people can enter a world that's shifted so much in 10 years, that's our challenge. Mm-hmm. I want to end with just Dr. King's call for the beloved community. It's one of the most resonant concepts of King's radical vision. And what if education's true purpose at the root is to create the beloved community where we live? And what if the purpose of education is not upholding a system because it works for you, but to change a system that doesn't work for you and to create and sustain a beloved community? I believe we're in a unique time. Can we dream of what could be possible? Radical, deep change that holds all of our humanity as the core of our purpose. I think how we work to make education a tool for the creation of the beloved community, it's our biggest challenge, and it can be our greatest tribute to King's legacy. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much, Debbie, for that. She was dropping a lot of historical facts and some gems in there. So we appreciate those accounts. There's a lot that has been shared today between our three panelists, and I'm sure you all are holding those things deep. I see some reflections in the chat, and we do have some things being dropped into the Padlet. So what I think we can do now, before we have just a few minutes before we have to go back to the main room, but maybe take a few questions from the Padlet. So I'm going to go over and look at what we have there. You can also do the same. It looks like maybe we have our first question. We have lots of reflections and just kind of capturings of things that resonated with people, but it seems like our first question may be under Dr. Royal's section. Dr. Royal, this question says, can you spotlight what you view as one of the most successful reforms that SDP has experienced?
What I view. So it's a little difficult, right? Because it depends on what you see as successful, right? And all of our reforms are constrained in a particular context. So, for example, I think about Constance Clayton, and I think about the way educators reflected on the pacing guide and the citywide tests that she created. Now, clearly this predated by almost 20 years, No Child Left Behind. And while everybody wasn't on board with this sort of formulaic, pacing guides and all this, one thing the folks I talked about were the ways they were pushed to use that information. So it wasn't used as a punitive measure. It was used for reteaching. It was used to see, where do I need to do something different with my students? How do I need to approach this differently? So I think that reform actually had a huge impact. The fact of the matter is, though, when you started looking at test scores over time, the test scores didn't rise for the masses in the way people expect them to, right? And so I ask, or I wonder, what we're talking about when we talk about success, because I don't know that those rising test scores are an indication. And when we know that test scores often follow socioeconomic status, then and that didn't shift, right? If anything, it shifted downward through the 90s. Where, because remember, it's in a context. And so when she leaves in 93, we're a year into Bill Clinton being president, and you have him going, and for those who may be my age, a little bit younger or definitely older, you may remember the attack on so-called welfare mothers and this moving people back to work at that point. And so there were definitely some very serious socioeconomic issues going on at the same time that those reforms were constrained by. I saw someone put in the chat the African-American history graduation requirement, which folks started urging for in the 1960s under Mark Shedd, which they get in 2005 under Paul Vallis, which then is seen as being rolled back under Ackerman when she collapses those offices, right? But we had a Black CEO, so that was supposed to mean something. And I'm saying this not to sort of, I don't know. I have a potty mouth, y'all, honestly. So I'm not saying it's to shit on Ackerman. God bless her wherever she is in the ether. I got to spend some time with her when I was a doctoral student. But I do want us to be so critical that we're not just okay with having representation, because representation alone, when you are urging still a neoliberal, racial, capitalist sort of perspective to school reform, is not going to get us anywhere. We don't need more diverse oppressors. So that's a really difficult sort of thing to nail down in terms of, you know, which specific school reform had the biggest impact. It depends. There's a number of things that we have to look at with that.
Thank you for that. We don't need any more diverse oppressors. Thank you for that, Dr. Royal. Panelists, Ishmael or Debbie, anything you want to say in relationship to that question or a comment that Dr. Royal raised?
I just want to reiterate, I don't believe that schools, the purpose of schools as they exist now is to educate. It's built on a really bad structural foundation. And I think it's up to us to really reimagine school and what it should mean, and resist. We have to resist.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to bed you back off of a diverse collection of oppressors. And that speaks really down to the heart of what we need to be doing, that we have to be very clear that what we're doing is going against what is being told and what is being pumped. And we have to embrace that level of resistance, both inside and outside of this profession.
Thank you for that. Debbie, as you kind of said in your session, and this session in general is about relearning history and thinking about the historical past and what it means for our current future. So I just have a question that's open to any one of the panelists. When you think about the historical accounts and the ways in which they show up in the work that you do, can you identify what you may see as one of the greatest challenges or barriers that current educators and leaders experience? And it's a two-part question, with connecting to the results or history of the history and the things of the past and what that means for what we need to do differently. And I'm asking that question in a way of, we constantly want this new reform, we do things, we always try new initiatives, but it seems to always go right back to a previous way it used to be. So if you can talk a little bit about the challenge and then how it connects to where we currently are in the landscape, and whoever wants to start can.
I'll start by saying selfishly, I don't think enough of us know the history of the district. So when you talk about, I mean, and I'm biased because I just wrote a book that's looking at the history of the district, right? If you want one now, there's one that's out already, just so that you don't think I'm totally selfish. Erica Kitzmiller just published a book on looking at Germantown High School and how that got constructed. She, I'm not remembering the name of her book right now. The Roots of Inequality, Erica Kitzmiller. The book came out in December. And so she looks at what caused Germantown High School to be sort of created, the bias that was infused in that historically, where that even came from. And she situates it in a larger history of the school district, but also school funding in the state of Pennsylvania. And she looks at some population shifts and things like that. But I don't think we know enough. You also could check out VP Franklin's The Education of Black Philadelphia, which I think is out of print, but you may be able to get it on Amazon. I don't think we know nearly enough about things that have been done, the context in which they were done, what forces were working against those reforms. And so if we have that information, there may be some things that have been done that actually can be retried in a new context with some different people at play. But we have to be really informed about what has been done. And that's not something I think that happens often enough. And what I've watched are a bunch of outside people coming into the district. And even though I no longer live in Philadelphia, I very much consider myself a Philadelphian. But seeing people who have no context, who have very little history, who have very little understanding of the struggles, the movements, the work, and then start implementing things as if you can just do in Philadelphia what you do anywhere else in the world. And that's not actually, I mean, you can, but it's not necessarily going to yield the results these folks are promising.
Yes, thank you. We just have about 30 seconds and then we have to go back, but anyone else can jump
Yeah,
in.
I was just going to say, I actually talked to Ish about this. I feel really strongly about this moment in time that we are like in an unprecedented space between the pandemic, between fascism, between, student debt, all these things that are crashing in. And I think it's the time for us to really think about what we want education to be, not inside any structure necessarily, but just what do we want for our youth and our communities? And once we can articulate that, how are we going to get it? So I think finding this space and time and then really putting heads together to demand, if we're going to stick with this structure, we have to start demanding policies and things that will bring about what we want in education. But I don't think we've taken the time to articulate what we want in education. We keep rerouting this like it's to get a good job, it's to get a good job. I don't think, like, there is very little meaningful work left in this economic system. So we need to think what gives life meaning? How do we reclaim our humanity? And what education will do that? And then start fighting for those things that we believe in. But I think we need to articulate the purpose first.
Thank you for that. Ish, any final words?
I'm just saying, like, peaks and valleys, y'all. And we need to recognize that, this system always goes back and tries to realign to the status quo. And the status quo within this society is white supremacy. And we got to be honest about that. And so what are we doing to push that forward against? And then how do we uplift our children to join in that fight?
Reformed education to knowledge to wisdom.
Thank you for that. Thank you. So we want to just go ahead and give our panelists again a virtual round of applause. We are grateful for the time, sharing your knowledge, sharing your research and your work with us. I see there's a couple of questions about Dr. Royal, if she's going to be on tour doing things. I'm just going to answer that for her. The answer is yes. I'm sure she will. We will get all of that information and share that with you all in our closing email after the session is over. And any additional questions, please log them on the Padlet so that we can capture them and have our panelists respond to them later. So we are going to conclude with session 2, Relearning History. And I'm going to drop the link to the chat. I'm going to ask you all to log out of this Zoom link and return back to the main room, the one we started in this morning at 9 o'clock. We just have a few final things we want to wrap up, and then we will be on our way for the rest of the day. Thank you again for allowing me to serve as the moderator for this session. Thank you, panelists, for your work. Thank you, participants, for all of your great community and conversation, and we will see you in the main room. Have a good day.